2, 3.
The
Critical Christian... You know what?
Podcast.
I think one of us will have to do it. This is the Critical Christian Podcast. We're your hosts, Dan and Justin.
Where we discuss the Bible, ask difficult questions, and give honest answers.
Whether you like the answers or not.
Today we're going to be working through some difficult questions in the book of Genesis. I think Dan and I both have a number of issues that pop out at us when we read through Genesis. So today we're going to be in the first 3 chapters, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
Among the topics to discuss, verse 126, and the discussion of man being created in our image, and some of the plural language for God in the book of Genesis. We're also going to talk about some of the redundant language, why it seems to exist, as well as why it appears that there are 2 accounts of creation within Genesis. We're going to talk about whether or not Adam was able to name himself, and a couple of anachronistic features, such as how did Adam and Eve know a language, why there was a flaming sword in Genesis 3:24. How does Adam and Eve know what bread is when they're instructed in Genesis 3? How was Adam and Eve supposed to know the ramifications given to them about childbirth, since childbirthing had not yet seemed to exist?
All right, so what was our first question then?
I think the first thing we want to take a look at is 1:6, Genesis 1:6.
All right, so this is from the NIV. And God said, "Let there be a vault between the waters to separate water from water."
Fantastic.
Now, I don't know what vault means in this one. I know what a vault is.
Sure. Well, if you ask King James, it says, "God, let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters."
I've heard firmament.
And let it divide the waters from the waters, because that's not confusing at all.
Right.
So I guess our question here is, what is the nature of a firmament? Or perhaps what is the nature of a vault?
Right.
Are they the same thing? Are they different words altogether?
I only knew a vault was for money. Or a pole vault. Those are my vaults.
Certainly you've heard of a vaulted ceiling?
No.
Oh. It's usually a dome-like structure. So the Hebrew word we're going to be looking at is rakia, and it does show up elsewhere in the Bible.
Okay.
So usually that's helpful for trying to figure out the meaning of a word.
Mm-hmm.
So the question is, what does it mean when we look it up in other passages? And the unfortunate answer is everywhere that it shows up, it typically is referring to the vault of the sky. It's really not all that helpful.
Not really, no.
So unfortunately, we're left with a couple English translations. It could be an expanse or a vault, or what the King James calls a firmament.
Mm-hmm.
A firmament is actually probably my favorite translation of that particular word. In Hebrew, typically, rakia, it means something closer to a solid device, like a dome, not one that's made up of gases like we would think of today. We do see parallels to this in other ancient Near Eastern texts. But we also see some descriptions that might be helpful for understanding how it was thought to be a solid device. So, for example, the Bible refers to it as holding back the waters and also containing windows and doors.
But it wasn't a solid device, right?
Well, I guess, are we asking what is the reality that we know from science, or what is the Bible saying?
Well, I guess we should ask, why are they different?
Oh, yeah. Why
is the Bible different than what we actually know now?
Right.
You know?
And that really comes in, the question needs to be asked is whether or not Genesis, especially chapters 1 through 11, is meant to be a historically accurate text, or if it is a mythological text.
Mm-hmm.
I think most Christians want to believe that it's a 100% accurate text, whereas most scholars would say, no, it's more along the lines of mythology, just like Egyptian mythology and other ancient Near Eastern mythologies. And to be sure, the ancients believed, not just the Hebrews, that there was a solid dome, And they discussed many times, the Hebrew sages, the Egyptians, the Hittites, on what the dome was actually made out of. So, for example, the Egyptians thought it was actually made out of a particular type of metal. Later Hebrew sages actually thought it was made out of a type of glass or a crystal. So there was a lot of opinions on what they thought it was made out of and how it could actually house the items that were considered to be celestial bodies, because those bodies were not beyond the dome necessarily. They were part of the dome.
Okay.
Yeah. In the Bible, we read a lot, too, about windows and doors within the firmament or within the sky.
So let me ask you.
Mm-hmm.
So we're talking about, we know that it's gas and outer space and all that, right?
Sure.
But in biblical times, they did not know that.
Even up to the Middle Ages, they believed that there was a solid firmament.
So whoever wrote Genesis did not know, right?
They were not given that information.
They were not given that information by God?
I would imagine by anybody, but the only person that would have the information at the time would have been God.
Right.
So obviously, no.
So this had to have been, incorrect, right?
I think that's what we would say, that it is factually incorrect.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know if there's any arguing about that.
No, I don't think.
There is arguing, because everything in the Bible is true, is what they say. You know,
that's what we're told, at
right?
least.
And so if
in America, in like the conservative Christian movement, that's the prevailing wisdom.
So if we're looking at, was it Genesis 1:6, right?
Sure.
And we already have an issue. That's not good. That's not good.
Pretty early on, right?
Right. Yeah.
I think the more difficult part is what the Bible has to say about the rest of the earth and what shape it might take on, which we're going to get to in the book of Genesis. We don't have to cover right now.
I'm interested in that one.
That would be a good one. Just to preview, the earth in Hebrew lore, as well as all ancient Near Eastern lore, was flat, and it was limited. You could find the end of the earth. It was something you could physically find.
And what chapter is this in?
That's not for this week.
No, but what chapter is it?
It is not a specific, explicit reference
within
it's
a
all
chapter.
Throughout it. Yeah.
All right. So we have to check this out first, then we can go back.
You've got to piece together passages throughout the Old Testament in order to arrive at the conclusion.
All right.
Because nowhere in the Old Testament do they just say, well, this is what the earth looks like. You have to infer by their language.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we're lucky enough that other Semitic languages, from the Babylonians and the Akkadians, they did provide us descriptions and maps and drawings of what they thought the earth looked like. And since we have that information and it seems to correlate with what is in the Bible, it is likely that we could assume safely that the Hebrew conception of the earth was similar to what the Babylonians, the Hittites, other Canaanites, what they believed.
Makes me feel as though this isn't like God breathed so much as it's person breathed, but based on what they know at the time,
right?
Which isn't to say it's wrong. It's just nobody corrected them, I guess.
Sure.
So I don't know.
Or
how that feels.
Perhaps, perhaps the attribution of certain parts of Genesis to the Creator may be unnecessary. How many ancient Hebrews would have said that the first couple chapters of Genesis are sacred scripture spoken specifically by God to somebody? That sort of thinking didn't arrive until after Moses. It seems more likely that the earliest Hebrews would have counted this as a mythological text containing answers to questions that people had.
But not real answers.
And it wasn't attributed to God until much later.
Oh.
That's like the old saying, yesterday's mythology is tomorrow's religion.
So Genesis should be Apocrypha?
Well, I think certain parts of Genesis probably should be considered to be mythological in nature.
Hmm.
That's not a popular opinion.
No, well, that's
But it's easy to arrive at.
what I said. You're going to get the answers whether you like it or not.
That's right.
All right.
And I don't know if either one of us like the answer, but
Yeah.
what other choices are there?
Yeah.
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 There's a lot of people that will dance around the language
Mm-hmm.
and try to make the language say what we want it to say. But it's just not a tenable position. Once again, we're going to get back to the shape of the sky and the earth in later weeks. So we don't want to create a whole episode just on that now.
Right.
But to be sure, this is a very difficult passage.
Mm-hmm. And it's the 6th verse.
Yeah,
In the whole
we just got in. We
Yeah.
just got in. So one of the other questions on our list is some of the redundant language.
Yeah, let's look at 1:16.
Sure.
God made 2 great lights, the greater light to govern the day, and the lesser light to govern the night. He also made the stars.
Mm-hmm.
God set them in the vault of the sky to give light on the earth, to govern the day and the night, and to separate light from darkness. So he kind of said the same thing twice, didn't he?
Yeah.
Why?
So in Hebrew prose, there's a thing called parallelism,
All right.
and there's another thing that gets mixed in sometimes, a more complicated form of parallelism that in English we refer to as like bracketing. And so what will happen is in a parallel, you'll say the same thing twice, but with slightly different wording. And typically, you've got 2 goals in mind. One of your goals is to help the Hebrew to be something that's easy to remember, just like reciting the verse of a poem or the verse of a song.
Mm-hmm.
The redundancy helps as a memory function. And then allowing the sentences to be similar but not identical, but also typically to sound pleasing. It makes it easier to remember, just like rhyming words that we did when we were kids.
Because, of course, back then this was before written language, so it had to be, passed down verbally, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
And then you'll get sandwiches or bracketed verses where it might start out with a section of text, and then it'll have a middle text, which is usually the most important part, the meat of the sandwich, and then the third part of the text will be a reiteration of the first part. So it'd be like writing an essay where you've got an intro, a body, and a conclusion, where your intro and your conclusion often have similar information, but is worded slightly differently.
Mm-hmm.
But the body is the meat of the article.
That's how I write my conclusions.
Right.
Yeah. Just restate the thesis.
Yes.
So people say that the Bible is one of the most well-written, beautiful
Oh, well, parts of it.
parts of it. So the question would be, so does this count because we know it's a part of how they wrote poetry and what have you back then?
I would say it counts.
Like, if we didn't know that, this would just be terrible, right?
Yeah, so the problem is we're reading it in English.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
That does not help.
There's some other fun redundancies as well that you'll find in the text. So redundancies within the language quite often can just be an emphasis, which we wouldn't do in English, but you would see quite often in Semitic languages.
Okay.
Very common.
Okay. Do you want to go to 120?
Yeah.
All right. So
Well, we don't have to do 120. Let's continue with the question about chapter 2 and why in the world do we have 2 accounts of creation?
Yeah, why?
Yeah, what did you have any thoughts on that?
Well, there are 2 different accounts, right?
Well, it seems that way, right?
It does seem, well, yeah, it seems like the first one. Here, let me pull that up here. Because it says that he, made the plants and all that, and then we're good to go. And then he's starting to do it over again,
Right.
And this says, now no shrub had yet appeared on the earth, but we already know so, yeah, why do we have 2 different accounts?
Well, I guess the first question is whether or not they're telling the same story.
Are they? Yeah, because one discusses dividing the firmament and all that, and this is
Right.
saying streams came up from the earth and watered the whole surface of the ground.
Right.
That's a little different, right?
Right. And a lot of people would be quick to point out that there seems to be contradictions in the order in which things were created between the two accounts. I actually find myself in the minority of Bible researchers in that I don't believe there are two different accounts.
Okay.
So what it appears is that in chapter 1, it is a description of the creation of the cosmos, and it ends with the creation of man.
Okay.
Right? Mm-hmm. So what happens then in chapter 2, it's not at the very beginning of chapter 2. The chapter division's not great. But anyways, what happens in the second account is really a story of the creation of mankind. If you look at the way the verses are distributed, the total verses in the first creation account, there are 25 verses in English at least, that speak about the creation and how God created. And there are only 6 verses attributed to the creation of human beings. In the next creation account, so-called creation account, there are only 3 verses attributed to general creation, and then the other 22 verses are dedicated to the creation of mankind.
Okay.
So it's clear they were written at different time periods, both by the verbiage that is used in the 2 different accounts. So if you look through some of the Hebrew language, you'll notice that they had a slightly different set of vocabulary between the 2 passages. But then also, the second account seems to backtrack. Rather than just saying this is a continuation of the previous story, and here is how God created mankind from this point forward. They're written at different time periods. The author of the second portion of Scripture had no clue, probably, that the second portion would be butted up against it in a book ever. So in order to tell the story of how God created man, he needed to at least do, say, a recap of how the earth was created before man was put on it.
So there was one author for the first recap, and then another author for the second one, is what you're saying. And somewhere along the way, they just got put together?
Oh, yeah. There's a great majority of Genesis that is quite clear there are multiple authors. And so,
because I know we say it's Moses, right?
Yeah, tradition would dictate that Moses...
except that he wrote about his own death. So
obviously he didn't narrate his own death.
Right.
But, and it is controversial among some Christians that there are multiple authors. We typically refer to the authorship of the Old Testament as referring to a structure called the documentary hypothesis, which details based on language, anachronisms within the text, and other textual features that there were probably 4, at a minimum, 4 separate authors.
I read about this, actually.
Oh, very good. What did you read? What do you know?
4 separate authors. So there's like, the priests. I know that's
the
one.
priestly class. Yeah,
That's they wrote the bulk of it, right? And then 3 more.
Yeah. So there's the Yahwists. So
because they had 2 different ways of spelling God's name, right?
Something like that. Yeah.
That's how you could tell that. Yeah.
Right. So, and these were, to be sure, these were groups of people. This was not an individual author speaking on behalf of all of the people within that document group. So, for example, when we talk about the 4 groups, JEDP, the Yahwists, the Elohists, the Deuteronomists, and the priestly, editors.
Yeah.
These are more or less classes of authors and editors, and there were certainly multiples within that time period and group.
And of course, this all comes about after Exodus, right?
Yeah,
when
all of these texts were most likely compiled sometime later than the Exodus, but it does seem, from internal evidence reading through Exodus, it does seem as though there were texts that were written down while they were still in the desert.
Okay.
And then they were integrated into larger works, larger bodies of texts. And so one of the classic examples of that are some of the laws that were given early on in Exodus. So sometimes referred to as the covenant code. So those are thought to be the earliest Mosaic laws that we find in the
So the Ten Commandments or what?
I don't think you would necessarily include the Ten Commandments in the covenant code. That's a different portion of the text, and it actually shows up twice, which that story doublet creates a little bit of issue, which we're still in Genesis, so we haven't got there yet, but we'll get there eventually.
Right.
But in the first two accounts that we see in Genesis, there are some clear language differences in the Hebrew text, and so far, what we see in the text is mostly Elohim.
Okay. Yeah.
So this early account is most likely really possibly incorporating a lot of northern tribe mythology, a lot of mythology that might have been prevalent within Canaan, even before the Israelites populated the area.
You know, I think it's weird that, so obviously some people think this was written by one person, yada, 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 but why would he keep changing the verbiage, if you will?
Right, yeah.
Why?
Why would one person
How do you
change?
reconcile that?
Well, there are actually some people that would say, well, if I wrote something age 25 and then I went back and I wrote something similar at age 65, would it have the same verbiage?
Yeah, and that's a good point, right?
That's a very fair point. The problem with that is, some of the words that show up within the Hebrew text are of a time period in which one person could not span the length of time.
Yeah.
And so that becomes a thing. And there are concepts and ideas that will show up in different parts of Genesis that match, we'll say, the common ideas of that particular author group. So the priestly class, were very much concerned with ritual purity, different things like that.
Well, they didn't want to be out of job, right?
Yeah, exactly.
This is self-preservation. This wasn't a religion, huh?
Right. Yeah. And so there are commonalities within the text, but what it seems to be, at least for the first two chapters of Genesis, where it now probably falls within mostly the Elohist document class, with maybe a little bit of Yahwist mixed in. So that's kind of, but nevertheless.
So later on, we'll have to, after we understand the two classes of priests, we'll have to go back here and see how they're different, right? Yeah. And what their agendas were.
Yeah, in fact, there's a number of people that have written on the topic. The earliest were some German scholars, but some of the differences between the four groups, and this is kind of a broad view of the topic. There are people who wrote very specifically at length about the difference between the document groups. But the J group, the Yahwist, is generally seen as a historical narrative type of people broken into tribes, and the theology focuses on God anthropomorphically and how he's interacting with the people groups.
Right, like walking in the garden. Right?
Exactly. He is a very personal God.
Yeah.
Yeah. The Yahwist also tends to quite often view God as a warrior or a liberator, or somebody who is going to march out to battle.
Okay.
The Elohist document group is also quite historical with lots of narratives, but it presumes that there's a division among the Israelites. It focuses on Joseph and the northern tribes and the theology is more religious and moralistic in concerns. So they're a lot less concerned about formal religion and more concerned about social structures and what is generally moral and should be observed, and less about the legalism. The D group, the Deuteronomist, a lot of people will say this is rooted in the book of Deuteronomy, and it is, but it is not strictly contained within the book of Deuteronomy.
No, I heard that Deuteronomy might have been written by what? Jeremiah?
I would say no. I think you're thinking of
Ezekiel?
Josiah?
Yeah, that's what
Yeah, the general consensus is that the book of Deuteronomy was quote-unquote discovered during the reign of Josiah, when he tried to do a lot of reforms within Israel and bring back the ancestral worship. It's a method for unifying the kingdom, or what was left of it.
I still think I meant Jeremiah, but we'll go with you.
Oh, sure. I'm unaware if there is a theory that Jeremiah wrote any part of Deuteronomy. I'm not aware of it yet.
Okay. Yeah.
The Deuteronomist is typically comprised of speeches and sermons, and is very concerned about the covenants that God makes with the people. It is also very concerned about the unique position that Israel has, being chosen by God. And then the priestly document class is more technical, focused on temple regulations, record keeping, statistics, genealogy, and things that would be important to the priesthood. Some of the themes as well that you'll see is how God communicates to the people. In the Yahweh text, God is described with human attributes and communicates verbally with mankind.
Mm-hmm.
In the Elohist, God communicates through dreams and visions.
Oh.
The Deuteronomist is not quite as well defined, nor is the priestly, but we see often that it is through either an interpreter or someone like Moses, or someone who is the point person between God and the community.
Wow, how are you supposed to know which one to believe then?
Well, it's not a matter of which one's right and which one's wrong. It's just a matter of the sources writing at different time periods and are concerned with different functions. Just like if you and I told a story, we would tell it two different ways. Mm-hmm. We'd emphasize very different points. And so you'll see that in the text, because these were all written separate from each other.
Right, yeah.
And then eventually was collected and placed into an assembled and accepted body of literature.
Okay, I think Jeremiah is the one who assembled it. You know what, I'm just going to shut up. All right.
Certainly, some of the more prominent prophets, like Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and even the ones that came later, were aware of the Old Testament texts and had exposure to them and probably had copies of them. What is interesting, though, is how few of the prophets actually directly quoted from some of the texts, like what we see in Genesis. You would expect a lot of that.
Right.
But you don't get nearly as much as what you might expect.
Which means they came along later, right?
It would seem that some of the texts in Genesis did come along later than what we would like to think.
Right, yeah.
But certainly the section that we're in right now is quite old.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point that if these prophets aren't referencing these books, I mean, and they should be, right?
Yeah, and
then
they do.
Why aren't they?
And they reference a number of events within the book of Genesis, but very generically. And so it's difficult to know if they're referring to oral culture or if they actually had the text and were able to put it to use.
Right.
And so that's why I said there's a difference between quoting from the text and then just referring to something that is culturally accepted.
Mm-hmm.
And we see a lot of that in the prophets. We don't see a lot of direct quotes, at least not from this part of Genesis.
Yeah. I mean, that sounds like a smoking gun right there.
It depends on what the thesis is, I would imagine. Whether or not Genesis is late or early, I think the question is yes and yes. Some parts are and some parts are not. Yeah. So, some other notes on the book of Genesis that we wanted to get to today is whether or not Adam named himself.
Oh, yes.
Did he pick his own name?
I don't know. How would he do that? Language hadn't been invented yet? Maybe?
Yeah.
I don't know how that works.
Right, and that's a good point. Because
Now, I know that they say that there's a heavenly language, a godly language, something like that.
Like
Maybe,
speaking in tongues?
Like speaking in tongues.
Sure.
Yeah, so is it possible that he had that language and then it evolved into, I don't know, Aramaic, Hebrew, Greek, what have you?
Yeah.
I just answered it for you, didn't I?
You might have. You might have. So, what are the gaps in the narrative?
Mm-hmm. Right.
Because it seems obvious from reading Genesis that it is not a complete account of what happened between God and mankind, right?
Mm-hmm.
So is there a gap in there in which God imparts information or knowledge to Adam and Eve that we're just unaware of?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's certainly a possibility. It's also possible that, they were created with the ability to speak a language.
Right.
My Hebrew professor would say God spoke Hebrew. So were Adam and Eve imparted with the ability to speak some primitive Semitic language, just as they were not created as babies, right? They were created as fully formed adults, we assume.
Mm-hmm.
So if God created Adam and Eve as fully formed adults, a couple questions come to mind. Did they have belly buttons since they weren't born?
Mm-hmm.
What were they able to know? It would seem to me that if he went through all the trouble of creating them fully formed and at a matured age,
right,
that he probably thought enough ahead that they were more or less pre-programmed to know certain things.
Mm-hmm.
But not everything, because they didn't
Clearly.
have any fruit from the tree of knowledge.
Right.
Yeah. So how much did they know? Because my conception was always that they lived in some sort of ignorant bliss until they sinned.
Yeah.
Yeah. But clearly they had enough that they can communicate in an unprimitive language, verbally, I would imagine. Either that or God had some sort of special way of communicating with them.
Adam was talking to God, right? Talking about how he was naked and what have you.
Yeah.
That was verbal, wasn't it?
Yeah, when God shows up in the garden to confront them, it was a verbal conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it seemed to me that there was some form of language from the beginning. But did Adam actually get to name himself?
Yeah.
I doubt. But Adam, interestingly enough, does give Eve her name.
Right.
Yeah. I have a theory on the names from like the first, we'll say, 8 chapters of the Bible.
Okay.
Most of the names in the first 8 chapters of the Bible correlate to the function of the character given that name.
Okay.
So, for example, Sarah was seed. Abraham was the father of many.
And I mean, I get that, but the language had to have been developed before they were all named then, right? So you would know what you're naming them?
I would say that, but even more than that, there's a move away. Once you get past chapter 8, you get into some of the later chapters. There's a hard move in Genesis where the names of the people stop being their function.
Right.
Now, and that's one of the reasons why many people believe that the first couple chapters of Genesis are really mythologies.
Ooh, That makes sense, actually.
Because if you're telling a story that is supposed to fill some knowledgeable gap, and you know that you were told that X, Y, and Z happened, and there were these two people that God had created, but you didn't know their names, well, you're going to supply them with names, aren't you?
Yeah, that makes sense, actually.
And so you're going to name them Adam and Eve. So Eve comes from the Hebrew stem, to give life. And if I remember correctly, Adam comes from the Hebrew stem to mean earth or ground, which, remember, he was formed from clay.
Right.
So you'll see also other people throughout Genesis that have names that correspond to who they are. Now, either their parents just got really lucky in naming them,
right,
or the author of at least the original story that was passed down had the foresight to give them a name that is equal to their function, which helps as a memory device,
right,
but also helps the story to make sense. And if you forget the names later when you're telling the story, well, the names are there for you. They're part of the story. So the details take care of themselves if you know the overall general story.
The problem with that is, it makes sense.
Yeah.
That's the problem with it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Right. We want that to not be the case,
right,
because it sounds like it was made up.
Yeah.
Right.
It's not good.
It is also possible, say, for example, that this was, these stories were given by God to write down. And, it's quite possible that God had given these names strictly because they would be able to be passed down verbally, and mankind had no ability to write at that time period.
Mm-hmm.
So just because a story seems contrived,
right,
does not necessarily mean it is contrived. But again, there are a lot of pieces of evidence in there that we would want to inspect to say, yeah, this story seems like it was mythology, or this story seems like it was sacred scripture spoken by God.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, there might be some place in between that too. It doesn't have to be an extreme.
Of course.
Yeah.
That's why there are so many different beliefs, because nobody can prove anything.
That's right.
It's very annoying. All
right. Another difficulty, and this is a big one, is the language within Genesis about our and us.
Oh, yes.
When referring to God.
Yeah, let's definitely get into that one.
Yeah, that's a big problem.
Which verse was that?
I think the first one that comes up is 126.
126. Let's pull that up here.
God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea," so on and so forth. I think the problem with that is quite obvious, right?
Yeah.
That probably doesn't need to be explained.
Well, explain it anyhow, though.
Yeah, who is our?
Who is our? Right. Yeah.
Right.
Is that the Trinity? Is that what's going on?
It could be.
Is he talking to his heavenly host of angels? Other beings? Is he talking to the dinosaurs?
A divine council, maybe.
Oh, a divine council.
Yeah.
That was better than my answer.
No, it might be necessarily the same thing as the angels.
Yeah.
Which you had mentioned. In fact, the divine council, also known as the children of God, in most of the ancient texts, get translated into English as angels. So there's a lot of Hebrew and then eventually Greek texts that refer to the angels as children of God. But when we translate it into English, it gets translated as angel. So, and to be sure, the divine council that is spoken about within the Old Testament were considered children of God.
So it does talk about the divine council?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Michael Heiser has written a number of books on the subject.
Oh, yeah, I read one by him.
Yeah, he's certainly not the first person to bring it up, but I think Michael Heiser, in the current time period that we're in, is probably the most popular author to make books on the subject that were readable by normal people.
So what was his divine council then?
Well, the divine council is a common feature in ancient Near Eastern religion.
That's not good.
where you have a head deity.
Okay. We're talking about the Trinity again?
We might refer to it as a pantheon.
Oh, pantheon of the gods, like Greek gods, right?
Or in Hebrew, maybe more accurately, Henotheism, where there is one supreme God, and then all other...
Like Zeus, right?
Somewhat like Zeus, except Zeus is not clearly a supreme creator of all. He seems to be on par with a few other deities, meaning he may not be all powerful. Typically in Henotheism, you have what appears to be a pantheon of gods, but there is a clear hierarchy where there is only one God within the pantheon that is to be worshipped, and he is the high deity, the God of gods.
That's what it sounds like here, right?
That tends to be the typical view that we would place in the Old Testament, is that Henotheism is actually what was practiced, not monotheism.
Of course, I mean, it's the same thing if there's only one God that you're worshiping, right? It
seems to be semantic.
Yeah, because what God without lowercase g is just another name for what, angel or divine or what have you?
It's more nuanced than that.
Of course.
Of course, part of the problem is that there's an entire mythology about the children of God within ancient Near Eastern texts and Canaanite texts, especially from the Ugaritic text, which was a northern Canaanite city that was most likely a very popular source of both religion and mythology for the earliest Israelites. A lot of what we see in the Old Testament in terms of worshiping Baal and worshiping other deities, these were not anomalies. These were features of Canaanite religion. These were the same people that claimed to be worshipers of Elohim. And I mean,
it wasn't that long ago. Canaan, that was, since the beginning of time. I feel like they would still know about God or something, right? That makes sense.
Yeah. What we find, a lot of the
so why do they worship two of them? Maybe because, like you said, Baal.
Baal. Yeah. Or Baal. There's a lot of ways to pronounce it.
Is it possible that he was real?
It is possible. It's possible that the whole divine council and all the children of God are a real feature, and there's enough verses in the Old Testament that speak of it that we would be doing ourselves a disservice if we didn't take it at face value. And that's where Baal comes in. Mm-hmm. So Baal is maybe not the favored, but the highest of the children of God. Mm-hmm. Much like Jesus is considered to be the exalted Son of God, Baal would have been the exalted son of Elohim. Ooh. And so
that sounds blasphemous, right?
He wielded a high amount of power within the pantheon of deities that we know about ancient
So
Canaan.
Are we talking about Satan here? Or is this totally...
No, Baal wouldn't be considered Satan at all.
Okay. Well,
Baal would have been a very important deity within the Canaanite religion, which, to be sure, is what the religion of Israel was based on. So the northern tribes, Israel, certainly their practices and their religion were rooted in Canaanite religion. They also worshiped the deity referred to as El and or Elohim, depending on the time period, which is, why Elohim is the name for God, but is also plural, is something that we'll definitely want to get into. There's no way we have time for it this week. We probably could dedicate a whole discussion to why the name of God is plural, and it is from a factual basis, right, not to do with the Trinity and everything to do with how the Hebrew language is formed.
Oh, really?
Yeah, in Hebrew, there's not just Hebrew. In other languages, there's concrete abstractions, where you can take something, you say like a verb, and you can convert it into a noun by using plural language. And so there's lots of ways in which that shows up in the Hebrew language. One of the classic ways, and unfortunately I forget the Hebrew word, but we can do this topic more justice later.
Right.
The word for virginity and the word for a virgin. So you've taken a noun, you've now abstracted it to mean something more generalized, like virginity.
Mm-hmm.
You're literally just taking the word for virgin and you're making it plural, and then you're using it in a context in where we have to assume that it is a generalized abstraction of the noun virgin. So we see this quite a bit in the Semitic languages, not just in Hebrew, and the word Elohim seems to be one of those characteristics where the word for God, El, which also happens to be the name for God, just like in modern Semitic languages, like in Arabic, Allah is the name of God, but the word also just means God. In ancient Semitic languages, especially Hebrew, the word El means God, but it also was the name of the high God within the pantheon in Canaan.
Mm-hmm.
Elohim is an abstraction of the word El that could just mean generically referring to a divine being. Or some people would say you would convert El to Elohim, it would mean you would change the word from God to divine. And that does actually fit pretty well with a lot of how the Hebrew prose is put together. They use a lot of synonyms when they create the text, because they want to say the same thing multiple times, but in different ways. So we've come full circle now with the parallelism.
You know what? I think I believe you, even if I don't really know what you're saying, but you're very
Right.
convincing.
Right.
Yeah. We'll have to, I don't know, work harder on that plural,
I think we can probably dedicate a whole half hour to that, because there are a lot of demonstrations within the Semitic languages and how this language feature works.
What I'd like to get into is ignoring that it's just some sort of literary thing. Maybe it is like there is, the divine council. Maybe there are other gods. Mm-hmm. Now remember, God with a lowercase is different than God with a uppercase.
Right.
Lesser gods, like is Baal,
Right.
I'd like to know if he was part of their, or was he in there? He was there in the beginning,
Right.
before humans. Was he an angel?
I don't know if we have answers to that.
Oh, I know, but
but it is interesting in Genesis 3:22. There's this fun thing that happens where after they've been cursed,
yeah,
it says, "And the Lord God said, Behold, the man has become one of us, to know good and evil. And now, lest he put forth his hand and take also of the tree of life and eat and live forever. Therefore God sent him forth from the Garden of Eden."
Yeah, that's weird, right?
Yeah, so the question here...
because it's saying that they actually were able to become like them. Now, probably not like God, right? So who are they becoming more like, right?
Well, I actually think the implication here is that they have become like God in that they possess knowledge and also immortality. And that is a big problem. You can have immortality or you can have knowledge. But if you have both, you've become a god, and now you're a threat to the gods. And this is another common feature. And it's a common feature in Semitic mythology, where there is, we'll say, a battle between the deities in heaven, and making sure that mankind is not able to ascend to the heavens and possibly even take over the heavens or have to fight for it. And the book of Enoch mentions something of this nature in the Tower of Babel,
Yeah.
So
right.
some of the reasoning for the Tower of Babel was that, just like here in Genesis, there is a generalized fear that mankind might ascend to the place of the gods. And then you've got a serious problem. And here we see the same thing, because mankind cannot be on par with the deities or be a threat to the deities.
Yeah, I mean, none of this makes sense, though, right? I mean, who's thinking that? God isn't thinking that, right? Who wrote that?
And so this is one of the reasons why I personally would classify the first 11 chapters of Genesis as mythology.
Okay.
Because it pairs so well with all the mythological texts from its time period. And it is in agreement in terms of geography, names, places, ideas that you find in the ancient texts. In a lot of the old Babylonian texts, you'll find that there are human beings that go through similar things that you see in Genesis, like a flood, and someone surviving a flood, and somebody actually having possession of a part of the tree of life, and then that being taken away by a snake. These are themes that all pop up in the ancient Near Eastern literature.
I don't want to hear about this. You're testing my faith.
It's all there. These are very common themes, very common ideas, including the idea that there are multiple deities, and that those deities have to make sure that mankind is, quote unquote, stayed within their place.
Well, let me say something. So the Israelites, Israel, their God was, of course, God, right?
The God?
The God, yes.
Like Yahweh?
Yes.
Or El, or Elohim? Or were they the same? Were Yahweh and Elohim the same deity?
I have literally no idea. All right, listen. But the other places, the other cities, they all had their own God, didn't they? And it wasn't the God. You know what I'm saying? So were those all just...
And so that's one of the features of Henotheism that we need to talk about, is there was typically a high God. He was, the Almighty, El Elyon. But the lesser deities still had a place. Much like we would say in Catholic theology, they would pray to the saints. It's not that they worshipped necessarily the saints as the supreme deity. It's just that they believe that the saints play a role in the heavens. They have a function or a job. So some saints, you might pray to. Classic example, when I was a kid in Catholic school, you might pray to a particular saint if you lost something. There seems to be a saint for everything. And so you'll see similar features of that in ancient Henotheism. It wasn't necessarily incompatible that you may have given homage or made a sacrifice to a lesser deity, because that deity was believed to have a particular role within the larger context of all the divine beings.
So what if, say this is true, what if Baal was one of those lesser ones that initially was part of God's counsel, and much like Satan thought he was, too good for this, and decided he would be he would be God now.
Sure.
So
that's an interesting thing, because we have text from Ugarit, which is the major metropolitan and religious center of northern Canaan, where a lot of the theology that we know about Israelite life and worship came from. And within those texts, we know that Baal actually had to earn his position as the head deity underneath his father. And so...
the father being God, right?
El.
God.
Yeah.
Okay.
So what we see is, and this is a common feature, we see it also with, say, like with Marduk in the Babylonian religion. So that would be the Neo-Babylonian religion. Marduk had to defeat the evil sea deity to earn his spot as the highest of the children of God.
Okay.
Baal, somewhat similar. There's a thing called a Baal cycle that tells the story of how Baal was died and resurrected, but eventually it had overcome the battle with the help of his sister or not, overcome the battle with the sea deity Yam, who coincidentally is related to the ancient Leviathan. So the ancient Leviathan was, at least in Semitic culture, was in relation with the sea deity, which was typically characterized as bad and chaotic. And the Leviathan was often pictured as what we would say like an evil pet or even a sidekick of the deity. And so you'll see, even in the Hebrew language, the word for the sea, especially at the beginning where the Spirit of God hovers over the waters, refers to the waters as Yam. Yam is the Ugaritic and the Hebrew name for the sea deity. And so there's a picture here of the Spirit of God subduing the chaotic sea deity, not just the waters. There's the imagery that the Yam is representation not of just the waters of chaos or the waters of the abyss, but that it wasn't Baal and it wasn't Marduk that subdued Yam. It was the Spirit of God. And so there's a little bit of what we would say in theology, some polemical language.
I don't know what that means, but you're basically saying that the writers of chapter 1, what have you, were saying that their God was subduing everybody else's gods. Right.
Yeah, the implication here is you've heard of Marduk, you've heard of Baal, you've heard of these other deities, but it was God who had subdued the waters of chaos. And you'll see some of that like in the book of Job, and that's why certain parts of Genesis are really interesting, because they seem to be written in opposition to what people thought of the time period.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
So we would say anti-Babylonian, but at the same time uses so much Babylonian imagery and context for understanding. And that becomes really apparent when you get to the early narratives, like with Esau, Jacob, the tower, Noah, and whatnot. There are a lot of direct references to more Eastern mythological ideas.
Okay.
But here in the early part of Genesis, back what we were talking about with the plural language, is generally agreed among scholars that the plural language is an artifact of a time period where the Hebrews legitimately practiced Henotheism, and there was no theological issue with referring to the gods as being multiples.
Did they practice this Heno? Is that what you said?
Henotheism.
Did they practice this because there were other gods?
Well, it would seem to be that if God had children, which is what they believed,
right,
that they would also be considered gods.
Right.
So there's no mental hang-up. Is if you're giving honor to God's children, there's not necessarily a conflict there. You know what I mean? It'd be like if you had children and I came to visit and I gave gifts to your children. I'm honoring your children. I'm making them to be special. I'm doing something kind for them. But at the same time, anything done for your children is done for you. So I'm also honoring you in the process.
Which would be all well and good, except I'm pretty sure you weren't supposed to worship these other guys, right?
And that, to be sure, is a major aspect of later Hebrew text within the Old Testament. The exclusive worship of God, especially under the name Yahweh, does not necessarily appear in the earliest texts of the Old Testament.
Oh.
Especially because he seems to be geographically located.
Right, that's what I'm trying to tell you. That's what I was saying. Like, he's the God of Israel.
Right.
And there are other gods of other places, you know?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Just like Yahweh, in the earliest of times, Yahweh would have definitely been a southern deity. In fact, some people believe that Yahwism was formed right near the border between Egypt and the southern Levant, not too far from where Moses' wife came from in the Midianites. So we do have archaeological evidence from early time periods. Maybe not as old as Abraham, but certainly as old as Moses.
Mm-hmm.
We have archaeological evidence that the name Yahweh existed in the southern Levantine region, where the Midianites would have been located, and where there would have been trade and commerce between the southern Canaanites and Egypt. So it's not till later that it seems that the worship of Yahweh is either mixed with the worship of El, or just supersedes it altogether. And that's why there's a lot of people will point out in the book of Exodus where the name Yahweh is revealed to Moses.
Mm-hmm.
It would seem that maybe that verse was placed there as an explanation as to why the name Yahweh at that time period where it was written for the particular audience, why the name Yahweh is used and not the name El or Elohim is used anymore. And the general idea is that your ancestors knew me as Elohim, but so my actual name
now it's a more personal relationship. Is that right? Is that right?
Yeah.
So God is changing.
Right.
I mean, not that he changes, but
and there's another, there's a lot of modern scholars that write about this topic, like Mark Smith and a few others, where they detail the developmental changes within the Old Testament text and how those changes affect the religious practices and how the references to Elohim and the references to Yahweh tend to correlate to what we know archaeologically, the changes that were happening, within the time periods.
What do you mean?
Well, it seems that as the southern tribes began to merge, especially when Israel and Judah were united under the united monarchy. You think of David as the uniter of the monarchy there.
Yeah, right.
It would seem that the language and the archaeological finds suggest that the worship of Yahweh expanded during this time period.
Oh, okay.
But even more so as the northern tribes began to lose power, and the southern tribe, Judah and then Benjamin, were gaining power, and then even more so when the northern tribes were wiped out completely by the Akkadians. Mm. So once the Assyrians came westward and took out the northern tribes in Israel, Judah became the only superpower left in the region. Mm-hmm. And they were free to write their narratives and sort of rewrite some of Israel's narratives. Yeah. And this is a time period where a lot of the Old Testament texts were placed together, and then we see a lot of interweaving of texts from this time period in order to make multiple stories go together by adding interconnected bits.
So they're trying to appease the North and the South, right?
Yeah, certainly during the United Monarchy, there was an attempt to unite the two religious fronts, the worship of Yahweh and the worship of Elohim. And the passage where the name of God, Yahweh, is revealed is often believed to come from this time period where there was people trying to, as the two kingdoms were merging, trying to explain that we are not two different kingdoms worshiping two different deities. They were indeed actually the same deity.
Right.
And of course, that's once again a very large topic we can spend an entire week on.
Sounds like we can spend a week on every topic.
Just about.
Yeah.
Just about. Nevertheless, the answer is it's very complicated.
Yeah. That's the answer to every question.
If it wasn't, this would have been a 2-minute conversation. We would have been done.
Yeah.
And we wouldn't have had to go through all this. So there's lots of gray areas.
Yeah.
Some of the other questions, for example, in 3:19, and we'll go there real quick. It says, "In the sweat of thy face shalt thou eat bread till thou return to the ground." One would have to assume at this point that they have no idea what bread is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Now, perhaps we go back to the theory of gaps. There are gaps in the story. Maybe at this point, God has at least spoken to them about how to make bread, given them instructions. Even though Adam has not been informed that he's going to have to work the ground.
Yeah.
And grow wheat and or barley or something to make bread with.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, if we're going with the God of the gaps, he could have filled in any gaps of knowledge.
Right.
Or it's just an anachronistic line because the author often, when you're authoring stories about the past, tend to, if you don't know all the details, fill in the details. And sometimes those details don't take into account time periods at which certain things existed.
Like a flaming sword, perhaps?
Yeah, exactly. I'm glad you mentioned it. The flaming sword, which shows up in 3:24 after they've been driven from the gardens.
Mm-hmm.
So he drove out the man, and he placed at the east of the Garden of Eden cherubim and a flaming sword which turned every way to keep the way of the tree of life. So, a couple problems here. I think obviously is one, the first weapon of war was created by God, not by man.
Right.
Second thing is, what was it actually a sword? Is it possible that it was something else, and then later authors had to interpret it as a sword?
Are we to believe God made the first sword?
It would seem really unnecessary to make a sword.
Right.
But then again, the function of the flaming sword is implied to hurt somebody if they come near.
Yeah, that's true.
The entrance. But I would question whether or not at this point in history,
they had swords.
All-seeing God would, give them the gift of metallurgy just to kill each other.
Right. Yeah.
And if so, was that what Adam and Eve eventually passed down the information to their children on what that device was, what it could be used for, and how it could be used to hurt other people?
No, that would be interesting.
Right.
Unlikely.
But, because Cain killed Abel with a rock, not a sword.
Yeah. So
clearly primitive there.
Wait a minute. So they didn't have swords.
It would seem
this
not.
had to have been a later addition.
It would seem that way.
It would seem that way.
Right. If God had given them swords or the ability to make swords at that time period.
At the very least, if they saw a flaming sword, they'd be like, that gives me an idea.
Or what if it was a flaming sword legitimately, but they had no idea? You might communicate to somebody what you thought it was, though. And then that might become memorialized in history.
You'd probably just go to flaming pillar, right?
Yeah, maybe.
Not a sword.
Or you could have said a stick.
A stick, yeah.
Yeah. Assuming that the original observer of the flaming object didn't know what it was. And we would assume that they didn't. Assuming the original observers of the object, Adam and Eve, and possibly even their children, saw the object and communicated to others what the object was, I can't assume they would use the word sword.
Right.
So it had to have been a later interpretation, most likely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It could have just been an interpretation then.
Right.
Like it actually happened, but somebody's like, it was probably a sword. What else would it be?
Right. That's my thoughts.
Yeah.
But, it brings up another kind of a anachronistic thing. In verse 3:16, says that Eve is going to have painful births.
Right. Yeah.
But they don't know what a birth is.
No, they don't.
Right. So this goes all the way back to the gaps again. what kind of gaps in the. We have to assume as a reader that there are. In order for the story to make sense, we have to assume that the gaps in the story were filled in by God, but not communicated to the reader.
Right.
Or else the story doesn't make sense. How does she know what childbearing is? She's never witnessed it.
Right, yeah.
Maybe she's seen an animal bear children.
Maybe.
At this point. They didn't name the animals.
What?
You know, animals existed. I don't know if they had sex yet or if they bore children.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, actually.
By inference, she might have known what it is just because she saw the animals.
Yeah, and they weren't in pain, apparently, when they were giving birth, right?
I think that's how the theory goes.
Yeah, okay.
You know, obviously the text doesn't say.
Right.
So we have to assume. But the general assumption is that painful childbirths were a direct result of the sin.
Yeah.
And so since the sin hadn't happened yet, the animal childbirths probably weren't painful, although it seems awfully cruel that the animals were punished for sin, Eve's sin.
You know what, that happens a lot, apparently.
Yeah, well,
sins of the father, what have you.
According to the text, all of mankind was punished.
Right, yeah. I think it's not very nice that we all have to suffer for, but...
It would seem...
That's a
unrealistic
topic unto itself, right?
But it is, and once again, it really plays into the purpose of the first 11 chapters of Genesis, where it's a mythology really designed to explain why things are the way they are. Well, why is childbearing painful? Well, here's why. Why are our lifespans limited?
Oh, here's one. Why do snakes not have arms?
Right. Why?
That's a good one, right?
Because every other animal, other than fish, every other land animal has arms and legs, right?
Yeah.
Well, why not the snake?
Right.
Right?
We must know.
Right.
Yeah, it's a very important question.
But it would seem to me that a serpent that had arms and legs was just like a crocodile.
So here's a question. We don't know anything about mythology nowadays, obviously.
I think we're largely untrained.
So, but the people back in those days when this was written, wouldn't they read it and go, oh, I get what they're doing? I mean, they wouldn't actually believe this, would they?
A lot of people would have read some of this stuff and knew it was a mythology, and they would have taken it to be less of a scientific historical text and more of a big picture idea of who God is, what he's like, what type of a deity he represents.
So they wouldn't necessarily read this and go, oh, okay, God is fake because the story is fake.
Right.
They would say all of their stories are fake, so why wouldn't this one be as well?
Well, I think that the ancients were okay with having a mythology that they knew was their best effort at understanding the beginning or the history, but also knowing that they don't have all the answers, that they're not going to get it all right, but based on the information they have, this seems to be the most plausible explanation. And we do the same things, both scientific thinker and religious thinker. We take the information that we have and we try to put together items that explain things we don't really have answers to. We take snippets that we know to be true, and then we try to apply it to the unknown. And I think a lot of that happens in Genesis 1 through 11, where they're taking things that are known to them, and they're applying it, manipulating it, and adjusting it to make sense to the Hebrew and Israelite thinking.
It's very believable.
Yeah. Of course, it could all be spoken directly by God,
right,
and have to be taken at face value.
Right.
But it is awfully hard to explain certain things
Right.
if we do that. Yeah.
But it's still possible. So if you're watching this, don't worry. All right, just turn this off.
That's right.
We're just making this up.
It's certainly possible. The goal behind the podcast is not to throw water on traditional beliefs.
Right.
I think the goal is to ask some of the difficult questions, understand that the academic viewpoints exist and they exist for a reason. I've been part of too many discussions where academic views are just completely thrown in the trash as heretical because they don't reinforce the traditional viewpoint, and they introduce a lot of gray area, whereas people don't like gray area. It's very hard to be confident in what you believe or to be confident in, where you think you exist in the world if you don't have solid answers. And I think people, for the most part, have a tendency to try to take complicated, confusing gray area and turn it into manageable, black and white situations that you can really wrap your arms around and have some level of confidence in. And our goal is to explore that gray area.
Yeah, and I mean, I consider myself a Christian.
Yeah.
But there's nothing wrong with asking questions.
Yeah, absolutely.
I feel like all it does is strengthen my faith.
Right.
And if you ask questions and they lead you further away from your faith, then you didn't really have that strong of faith to begin with.
Right.
So I don't know.
Yeah, certainly part of what we're doing here is there's going to be some people that walk away with different opinions. Some people are going to struggle, and some people are going to find a renewed confidence in their faith. And they might listen to the words that I'm saying and say, hey, that guy's an educated dummy, and now I'm even more solidified. Obviously my goal is to never turn anybody away from the faith, but I do always try to ride that fence between blind faith and questioning everything.
I think blind faith is the worst thing you can have.
The difficult part is, there's so many biblical references to that being a desirable trait.
You got me there.
Yeah. But I think for the most part, we're out of time for this week.
Yeah.
And so, if there's issues with topics that we've discussed this week, obviously, send us messages. You can email us. You can message us on the YouTubes or on your popular, podcast platforms for clarification, or even make requests for deeper dives into some of the topics, because these are really overviews. And we're trying to cover a lot of ground within the Old Testament. And in order to do that, we have to move through topics rather quickly and unfortunately give a lot of generalized opinions and answers. But if we get enough requests, we certainly are not above dedicating podcast weeks to looking deeply at one or two particular issues that really maybe we should bring up and explore all of the archaeological evidence and really open up the Hebrew Old Testament and go through some of the language to make sense of what's happening there. So don't be afraid to ask hard questions back at us, or even question things that you've heard us say. Any concluding thoughts?
Sounds good.
Fantastic. I think we're supposed to say something like and subscribe.
Like and subscribe.
Ring the bell or something. And
ring the bell, guys.
Yeah, and then we'll see you in a week.